You walk through a towering stone gate, the silence broken only by your footsteps. But with every step forward, you're being watched not by guards, but by the castle itself. Hidden beneath the cobblestones, behind cold walls, and above wooden beams lie devices meant not to defend, but to maim, crush, impale, and kill. These weren't just fortresses, they were death machines, designed by paranoid lords and sadistic engineers. What you think was a simple home was a nightmare in stone. In the medieval period, a castle was more than a military outpost. It was a statement of dominance, a machine of control, and a reflection of fear. Built from stone and silence, its design served not only to repel invading armies, but to instill a sense of dread in anyone who dared to approach. Every wall, every gate, every winding corridor spoke to a reality in which power was fragile and violence was always near. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the feudal order had taken root across much of Europe. Kings ruled in name, but true authority often rested with regional lords, many of whom lived under the constant threat of rebellion, assassination, or siege. Their castles became both refuge and weapon. They weren't designed merely to withstand siege engines or cavalry, they were created to outthink human ambition. And in a world where betrayal came as easily as disease, ingenuity became as important as brute force. At their most basic, castles served as defensive structures, but their architects thought well beyond the battlefield. They crafted spaces meant to disorient. Narrow spiral staircases turned clockwise, favoring right-handed defenders and crippling right-handed attackers. Slits in the walls allowed arrows to fly out, but left no opening for return fire. Gates weren't just locked, they were layered with traps, murder holes, and false entries. The primary objective was never just to stop an enemy at the walls, but to punish him the moment he stepped inside. This mentality extended to the unseen enemy: spies, assassins, and traitors. In royal courts and noble halls, betrayal often came cloaked in conversation. Some castles were rumored to have hidden passages designed not just for escape, but for surveillance. Secret staircases allowed guards or nobles to listen through walls. Some rooms were engineered to echo footsteps and voices, giving away the presence of any uninvited guest. The paranoia wasn't unfounded. Throughout the Middle Ages, noble assassinations were not uncommon. In 1358, the brutal Jacquerie uprising in France saw peasant rebels breach and burn dozens of castles, often torturing their noble inhabitants. In England, the Wars of the Roses led to an era in which noble alliances shifted with the wind. Castles had to serve as strongholds not only against distant enemies, but from those within arm's reach. The architecture adapted. Gatehouses became multi-layered kill zones where intruders were trapped between two portcullises and assaulted from above. Moats weren't just deterrents, they acted as visual warnings and physical obstacles. Trapdoors led to pits. Walls angled inward to catch. Ladders. Even the very approach to some castles was deliberately confusing, bending in curves to expose an enemy's flank before he even reached the gate. Inside, the design continued this calculated cruelty. Hallways narrowed into choke points. Windows sat too high to breach. And behind the grandeur of throne rooms and chapels, darker chambers existed used for confinement, interrogation, and execution. In places like England's Warwick Castle or Germany's Burg Eltz, these dual realities, beauty and brutality, stood side by side. These castles, often romanticized today, were forged from the medieval mind-to-mind preoccupied with loyalty. treachery, and control. Each stone laid was a precaution. Each trap set was a warning. This was not merely architecture, it was warfare shaped into walls. And for those who lived in them, ruled from them, or tried to conquer them, the message was always clear: survival required more than strength. It demanded fear, foresight, and the will to turn one's home into a weapon. Few architectural features of medieval castles revealed the calculated brutality of their design. Quite like the murder hole, known in French as meurtriers, these openings were not built for light or air but for execution. Situated above entry points such as gateways, passageways, and narrow courtyards, murder holes served a singular purpose: to attack from above with impunity. They were typically found in the gatehouse, the most fortified part of any castle. When an enemy force reached the outer drawbridge and forced the front gate, they entered what seemed like a transitional corridor, but it was a trap. Locked between two heavy portcullises, the attackers stood in what appeared to be a holding area. Above them, unseen defenders peered through a murder hole. From there, they could unleash projectiles, boiling liquids, or scalding sand, all while remaining safely behind thick walls. Contrary to popular myth, boiling oil was rarely used, was prohibitively expensive and difficult to prepare in large quantities. More commonly, defenders would drop heated sand, which could slip into armor joints and cause excruciating burns, or pour boiling water heated in cauldrons. Large stones, wood beams, or even quicklimber, caustic chemical that could blind or suffocate, were used with deadly efficiency. Sometimes, human waste was added to the mix, particularly during prolonged sieges, when disease became a secondary weapon. Carnarvon Castle in Wales provides a textbook example of this defensive method. Built under Edward I in the late 13th century, its gatehouses were designed with murder holes above every approach. These strategic apertures were narrow enough to protect the defender, but wide enough to deliver destruction directly onto enemies caught below. The entire structure was engineered to draw attackers inward, then trap and eliminate them in confined, elevated killing zones. Another notable example stands in northern France. Chateau de Pareffens, originally constructed in the late 14th century and later restored under Napoleon III, its gatehouse shows multiple murder holes above the entrance. These were carefully angled, giving defenders a clear vertical line of fire down into the entry path. The location of these holes, with the limited maneuvering space below, left invaders with few options. Retreat was blocked. Ascent was impossible. The only path was forward, under fire. In many castles, these death funnels were part of a layered system. Murder holes worked in tandem with arrow slits in the flanking towers and battlements above. Attackers would find themselves harassed from three directions: side, front, and top, without any meaningful cover. This was not just physical warfare, it was psychological. The chaos of being trapped in a confined space, surrounded by screams, fire, and boiling liquid, was designed to break morale as much as it was to take lives. The murder hole remains one of the clearest examples of how medieval architecture was shaped by a relentless focus on survival and control. These weren't accidental features. They were instruments of power, carved into stone, calculated for efficiency, and built to send a clear message. Entering the castle did not mean safety. It meant walking straight into a killing ground, collapsible. Flaws were among the most treacherous features ever embedded within the architecture of medieval fortifications. Unlike arrow slits or towering walls, these traps were hidden in plain sight, distinguishable from the solid stone or timber around them. Their purpose was simple: to eliminate intruders without confrontation, through gravity and design. In some castles, particularly those in regions vulnerable to infiltration or internal revolt, floors in key passageways or chambers were constructed with hinged panels or removable planks. These were typically installed in areas that would seem most secure inside private chambers, treasure rooms, or narrow corridors leading to the lord's quarters. The mechanism, once triggered, sent the unsuspecting victim plummeting into a shaft below, sometimes several meters deep. Historical evidence for such traps is rare, but not absent. A prime example exists in Pajama Castle, Slovenia, carved into the mouth of a cliff. Their hidden passageways and vertical shafts suggest a layered defensive design intended to protect the occupants while disorienting or eliminating intruders. While the false floor trap is difficult to preserve archaeologically, some reconstructions and accounts point to their presence in defensive architecture, particularly in parts of Eastern Europe and fortified monasteries, where security from both armed assault and espionage was a persistent concern. These pits were not empty. Many were lined with sharpened wooden stakes or iron spikes, similar in concept to the Trauder Laut, a military field trap used during sieges. In such configurations, a fall through the floor was not just disabling, it was fatal. In other cases, the shaft itself functioned as a prison, narrow and dark. These holes often offered no means of escape. Captives were left without light, food, or rescue, dying slowly from injury, exposure, or starvation. In some castles, these chambers beneath the floors were designed with smooth vertical walls and no ladder or foothold, ensuring that once someone fell, escape was physically impossible. The psychological impact of such a trap was just as significant as the mechanical outcome. An intruder entering a fortified space had to question every step whether the floor beneath their feet was solid, or a cleverly disguised gateway to death. It turned movement itself into a risk. The fear of an unseen trap slowed invaders, exposed them to other lines of defense, and reinforced the perception that the castle was not just defended, it was alive with malice. While detailed manuals of such traps are scarce, the concept of mechanical deception in castle defense is well documented. Engineers and masons, especially during the later Middle Ages, were employed not just for strength of construction, but for ingenuity in repelling both overt and covert threats. Castles like Bodiam in England and Schlieren in Switzerland incorporated complex internal layouts that allowed for surveillance and control over every part of the structure. Though the physical remnants of false floors are difficult to verify today, the concept was certainly within the capacity and mindset of medieval builders, particularly in contexts where betrayal or stealth were realistic threats. In the end, the false floor served a strategic message as much as a lethal purpose. It warned that not all defenses were visible, and that the most dangerous threats weren't always met with swords but with silence, calculation, and a single step too far. Moats served more than just a physical barrier in medieval castle defense. When paired with strategic engineering, they became tools of quiet execution, concealed beneath footbridges, behind stone facades, or hidden within sally ports. Some castles integrated trapdoors that led directly into water-filled pits. These weren't accidents of design. They were deliberate, calculated, and in some cases lethal. While the popular image of a moat centers on a broad ditch of clean water surrounding castle walls, many were far more hazardous, especially in urban strongholds or lowland fortifications. Moats often doubled as sewage systems, fed by rain, runoff, latrines, and grey water from kitchens. Falling into such a moat was not only dangerous due to depth or current, it introduced the risk of infection, suffocation, or drowning in filth. In these environments, trap mechanisms were sometimes built into drawbridges or causeways to collapse or swing under pressure, plunging attackers into the murky depths below. Archaeological studies of 13th and 14th century castles, such as Bodiam Castle in East Sussex, suggest that access points near moats were carefully concealed and likely used both for secret exits and tactical purposes. Some castle gatehouses included postern doors positioned just above water level, though often described as escape routes for defenders. The possibility remains that these were also adapted as passive traps, doors that could be opened remotely or suddenly under an unsuspecting person's weight. In flooded dungeons or oubliettes narrow, vertical shafts used for imprisonments, some lower chambers were intentionally placed below the waterline. One historical reference comes from the Château de Loches in France, where prisoners were sometimes held in chambers that flooded seasonally, creating a risk of drowning. Though not every case was an engineered trap, the consequence was the same. Water served as an instrument of death. The concept of weaponized water appears again in the layered defenses of Italian and German castles. In Castel del Monte, southern Italy, researchers have noted complex underground water drainage systems beneath the castle's foundation, though not explicitly linked to execution. The knowledge and capability to manipulate water flow within the structure were well established. It's in this context that the idea of concealed flooding or sudden drops into submerged spaces becomes plausible. These traps required no guards, no blades, no noise. Once the mechanism was triggered, the victim had little time to react. In full armor, even strong swimmers were at a disadvantage. Panic, weight, and darkness made escape nearly impossible. Unlike open combat, these drowning traps left no marks, no blood, and no alarm. They operated on silence. In times of siege, where rationing and morale were paramount, removing a spy or saboteur without alerting the larger force outside was invaluable. Castles designed for prolonged conflict often favored such self-contained mechanisms, efficient, repeatable, and untraceable. Water, in these contexts, wasn't just a defense, it became a judgment. Swift, quiet, and absolute. The portcullis. It was never intended to be just a barrier. In many medieval castles, it doubled as a weapon, one capable of killing instantly. Constructed from reinforced timber or iron, and often embedded with steel spikes. The portcullis operated on a simple mechanism. It dropped vertically, guided by grooves cut into stone walls, and was controlled from above using ropes or counterweights. But when triggered at the right moment, it didn't just block it, crushed at Dover Castle in England, one of the most strategically important fortresses. In medieval Europe, the gatehouse was a calculated death trap. Attackers who breached the outer defenses and crossed the drawbridge would find themselves in a narrow passage between two massive portcullises. The first would drop behind them. The second, ahead, remained closed. Now enclosed in a confined stone tunnel, the invaders were exposed from all angles, arrow loops on both sides, murder holes above, and defenders in the towers. If the rear portcullis had not killed, it had sealed. There was no retreat. Some portcullises, particularly during the 13th and 14th centuries, were fitted with iron spikes along the bottom edge. When dropped from heights and times weighing over 1,000 pounds, the impact was devastating. Man caught beneath one wouldn't be wounded. He would be spitted. This wasn't a passive defense. It was mechanical execution in Bodiam Castle, constructed in the late 14th century in East Sussex. The fortified gatehouse includes grooves for not just one, but two portcullises, indicating a system designed to trap intruders in between. This allowed defenders to time the drop with precision. While no surviving records document a specific execution by portcullis in Bodiam, the structure's design makes the intent clear. If the first didn't impale, the second would trap. And in that narrow zone, attackers could be slaughtered from above with arrows, boiling liquid, or even fire. Portcullises were also used during moments of internal betrayal. When lords suspected disloyalty from within, the castle's gatehouse became a controlled chamber of judgment. In documented cases, traitors were allowed to enter only to be executed once they crossed the threshold. The gate would fall, and the space designed with acoustic amplification would echo the result. This method eliminated the threat quickly and sent a message to any witnesses on either side of the wall. The engineering was straightforward but lethal. A series of pulleys, winches, and counterweights held the portcullis aloft. When the rope was cut or released from its fastening, gravity did the rest. There was no opportunity to evade. The drop was near instantaneous, and with spikes positioned to align with human heights, the device delivered maximum damage in a confined area. The guillotine-like portcullis embodied the brutality of castle defense. It required no sword, no soldier, no warning. With one pull of a lever, the fortress became the executioner. Its weight did not discriminate. Whether knight, spy, or traitor, the message was the same. Step in uninvited, and the walls themselves would crush you. The spiral staircase was more than a space-saving feature in medieval castles. It was a tactical weapon built into the very walls. Found in towers, keeps, and fortified gatehouses across Europe, these winding stone stairways were almost universally designed to ascend clockwise. This wasn't a matter of architectural tradition. It was a deliberate choice that turned every step into a disadvantage for the attacker. The logic lay in human anatomy. Most warriors fought with swords in their right hands. As an attacker climbed a clockwise spiral, their sword arm was pinned against the central column known as the newel, while their left, typically the weaker side, faced outward into the curve. This constrained their range of motion, reduced visibility, and made coordinated strikes nearly impossible in the tight, winding space. Meanwhile, the defender above had the advantage. Their right arm had ample room to swing, stab, or strike downward along the outer edge of the stairwell. They occupied the high ground, able to use gravity, momentum, and superior footing to control the tempo of the engagement. A single defender, standing a few steps above, could hold off multiple attackers for an extended period, and in a confined space with limited visibility. Chaos spread quickly among the ranks below. This architectural strategy was widespread by the 12th century. Castles such as Conwy and Caernarfon in Wales, commissioned by Edward I in the late 13th century, featured precisely this kind of design. The defensive logic extended even further. Staircases were often narrow enough that only one person could ascend at a time, turning any assault into a bottleneck. Some were designed with uneven steps, purposely varied in height or depth, to trip unfamiliar feet in certain cases. The spiral staircase was rigged for additional defensive measures. Murder holes were cut into the ceilings or sidewalls at landings, allowing boiling water, hot sand, or stones to be dropped onto those ascending. A single misstep or moment of hesitation in such a space could lead to a deadly fall down the spiraling stone shaft. There were exceptions. In rare cases, castles built by left-handed nobles reversed the spiral to favor their own fighting stance. One such example is Castle May in Scotland, which features a counterclockwise staircase, likely designed for left-handed defenders. The staircase, often overlooked in popular depictions of medieval warfare, was a built-in ambush. Its design didn't just defend it disoriented. It broke the rhythm of an assault, isolated invaders, and gave small groups of defenders a critical upper hand. In sieges where time, space, and manpower were limited, that advantage could decide the fate of the entire stronghold. The turning staircase was not a trap in the traditional sense. It didn't drop or crush, but in the calculated architecture of medieval defense, it was no less lethal. It weaponized structure itself, forcing the attacker to fight the building as much as the man guarding it. In the medieval world, wealth didn't sit in banks. It was kept in rooms vaulted, locked, and often sealed behind layers of stone and steel. These treasure chambers were not only repositories of coin, jewels, and regalia, but also symbols of power, inherited legitimacy, and feudal security. And for lords who lived in a world of betrayal and siege, paranoia shaped the way these rooms were guarded. Treasure rooms, often located deep within the castle's inner keep or beneath the Great Hall, were accessible only through narrow corridors, guarded passageways, or steep stairs. Entry was limited to a trusted few, and in some cases, layered with defenses that went beyond simple locks. Across parts of Central and Eastern Europe, there are references, fragmentary but persistent, of mechanical and chemical traps intended to protect these riches, not just from armies, but from treachery within. Pit traps were among the simplest, yet most effective methods. Concealed beneath rugs, barrels, or tiles, collapsible panels could drop an intruder into a shaft below, a dungeon or an oubliette. In wealthier castles, some were lined with stakes or designed to flood. These devices were often tied to pressure plates or tripwires positioned near doors or chest lids. Such mechanisms, while rare in surviving form, are mentioned in descriptions of 15th century noble strongholds in the Holy Roman Empire and parts of Transylvania. More sophisticated deterrence involved chemical or toxic protections. Medieval knowledge of alchemy, particularly from Arabic and Byzantine sources, included recipes for poisons made from arsenic, belladonna, or powdered metals. There are scattered references in 14th century legal records, especially in Italian, and Spanish sources of nobles accused of poisoning coins or using toxic inks on false inventories to punish or kill thieves. Whether these methods were widely used or just feared is unclear, but the belief in their existence was powerful enough to dissuade many from attempting theft. In fortified religious sites and royal residences, collapsing ceilings or wall-triggered mechanisms have also been proposed. Though few verifiable examples survive, architectural analysis of late medieval structures like Château de Chinon in France and Corvin Castle in Romania suggests that certain ceiling beams or wall cavities may have been constructed to fall under stress or deliberate sabotage, whether used against invading enemies or unfaithful retainers. These elements reinforce the idea that touching a noble's treasure could cost more than a limb. Beyond physical threats, myth served as a final line of defense. Across Europe, tales circulated of cursed gold, bewitched chambers, and guardian spirits. In some royal houses, rumors were cultivated to protect wealth. The House of Habsburg, for instance, was associated with occult symbolism by the 16th century, rooted in centuries of accumulated superstition. Earlier still, in castles like Crac des Chevaliers in Syria once held by Crusader forces, there were stories of enchanted vaults and keys that would destroy the unworthy. Whether real or imagined, the layering of fear, superstition, and ingenuity around treasure rooms spoke to a broader truth. In an age where loyalty shifted easily, and siege was always a possibility, no treasure was safe unless it could punish the hand that tried to steal it. Some castles were built not just to defend against enemies, but to eliminate them from within quietly, efficiently, and without witnesses, hidden behind stone walls or beneath staircases. Certain fortresses in medieval Germany and Eastern Europe included passageways that led not to safety, but to disappearance. These were not escape routes. They were engineered conduits for control designed to deliver a prisoner, a spy, or a political rival straight into the hands of interrogators. In several 14th and 15th century German castles, particularly along the Rhine and in regions like Bavaria and Thuringia, architectural plans and later restorations have revealed concealed trapdoors and pivoting wall panels. These mechanisms were often located in reception halls or near audience chambers, positions of trust and diplomacy. With a signal or hidden lever, a section of floor could be shifted or a doorway could open, swallowing the targeted individual into a narrow shaft or corridor. From there, the path did not lead to cells in the conventional sense, but to isolated chambers below ground, soundproofed by thick masonry and often devoid of natural light. The fortress at Hohenzollern, rebuilt in the 15th century and heavily modified in later centuries, is one of several that maintained underground interrogation rooms. These chambers were accessed by tight stairwells or concealed passages beneath the Great Hall. Visitors who descended into these spaces often noted the oppressive silence and the deliberate design to separate the prisoners suffering from the life of the court above. In Eastern Europe, particularly in the Carpathian regions of present-day Romania, similar systems existed. A Hunedora's Corvin Castle, also known as Hunyadi Castle, a torture chamber located beneath the council room, could be accessed by a concealed entrance. The space was equipped not just with implements of pain, restraints, shackles, stretching devices, but with acoustics that served a dual function. The vaults were designed to contain echoes inward, amplifying screams within the chamber. Yet in some cases, the design allowed faint traces of those sounds to travel upward, leaking into corridors or servant spaces. The effect was intentional. The threat didn't need to be seen to be understood. These architectural decisions were not random. They served the political culture of the time, where fear was a tool of governance. Executions were public, but torture was private. Disappearances, unexplained, could destabilize dissent. The threat of being led into a meeting and never returning became as effective as the gallows. The use of these hidden mechanisms continued well into the early modern period. In certain parts of the Holy Roman Empire, judicial torture remained legal into the 18th century. Castles that once housed nobility became administrative centers, and their subterranean designs were adapted for the interrogation of heretics, criminals, or rivals. Some torture doors were sealed during renovations, others destroyed, but references to them persist in local records, folklore, and legal archives. These spaces weren't elaborate myths. They were architectural facts built into the foundations of power. The Iron Maiden may never have existed in widespread use, but the hidden corridor, the collapsing floor, and the torture chamber beneath the court were entirely real. They served a simple, brutal function, to erase threats without spectacle, to make people vanish and ensure the rest heard just enough to never ask why. In the courts of medieval Europe, the throne was more than a seat of power. It was the embodiment of authority. Its elevated position, often placed beneath ornate canopies or carved into stone dais platforms, projected control, legitimacy, and judgment. But beneath the grandeur lay a persistent undercurrent of fear. In rare but chilling accounts, that fear took form in the design of the throne itself, though widely debated among historians. The concept of booby-trapped thrones or execution chairs appears in both written records and oral tradition. Some of these reports point to chairs rigged with spring-loaded spikes, retractable mechanisms, or poisoned elements, used not in public executions but during private audiences, where no witnesses were present and no trial necessary. One of the most widely circulated stories involves a 15th century Italian noble house. Likely the Borgia court where a specially constructed chair was allegedly fitted with concealed blades. The visitor, accused of conspiracy or betrayal, would be asked to sit, at which point a mechanism would trigger, impaling them through the lower back or spine. Though no physical evidence of this device survives, the account persisted through multiple chronicles of the period, including whispers among ambassadors and rival courts. Whether fact or fear, its presence in diplomatic correspondence suggests it was taken seriously by contemporaries in Eastern Europe. Particularly in the courts of Wallachia and Moldavia, tales of deadly thrones also emerged. Some claim that Vlad III, better known as Vlad, the Impaler, employed a throne rigged to collapse, casting the seated target into a pit lined with spikes or sharpened stakes. While this is more likely an exaggeration tied to his broader reputation for brutality, it reflects a documented culture of deterrence through theatrical terror. What's more historically grounded is the use of poisoned fabrics or fasteners on chairs. In several Renaissance courts, including those in Venice and the Papal States, records survive of assassinations carried out using contact poison substances derived from arsenic compounds or toxic plant extracts, absorbed through exposed skin. Some of these were allegedly applied to the armrests or cushions of ceremonial seats, targeting unsuspecting visitors during private meetings. The symbolic power of these devices was arguably as important as their function. Whether or not such thrones were regularly used, their rumored existence served as a psychological weapon. Courtiers and emissaries understood the unspoken threat, that proximity to the ruler could be as dangerous as defying him. In an era where conspiracy was common and assassination a political tool, the throne was not always a place of safety. Even into the early modern period, the concept endured. In 17th century Bavaria, court records describe a ceremonial seat removed from use after servants claimed it swallowed a man. No mechanism was found, but the incident was enough to provoke concern. The chair was sealed and stored in the fortress archive. There is little definitive proof of widespread use of trapped thrones, but the rumors alone, persistent across regions and centuries, suggest a shared cultural truth that in the politics of survival, fear was as useful as steel, and in the wrong court, sitting down might have been the last move a traitor ever made. Castles were designed to be sanctuaries, strongholds against siege, betrayal, and revolt. But in a world where power bred paranoia, some of the most secure fortresses became the stage for an ironic reversal. Traps meant to repel invaders, isolate enemies, or slow attackers often turned inward. During moments of rebellion or political collapse, they sealed the fate of the very men they were built to protect. The fall of Richard III at Bosworth Field in 1485 marked not just the end of a king, but the exposure of the limits of fortress safety. Before his final battle, Richard had relied on Nottingham Castle fortified, elevated, and considered nearly impenetrable, but its value depended entirely on loyalty. When key allies defected and communications failed, the king was forced to ride out. The walls that had once shielded him couldn't prevent his isolation, nor the treachery that followed. He died on open ground, not because his castle failed, but because it had become useless in a fractured kingdom. More explicit was the case of Piers Gaveston, the favoured companion of Edward II. In 1312, Gaveston was imprisoned at Scarborough Castle, a formidable coastal fortress with thick curtain walls and a secure keep. But the strength of the stone meant little when his enemies' nobles, opposed to his influence over the king, surrounded the fortress and cut off supply. Trapped inside what was intended to be a defensive retreat, Gaveston surrendered under terms. He was taken out and executed. The castle hadn't been stormed, it had simply become a cage. In Bohemia, Karlstein Castle was a towering stronghold. Built in the mid-14th century by Emperor Charles IV, intended to safeguard the imperial crown jewels and religious relics. It was among the most secure sites in the Holy Roman Empire, but its elaborate security measures, multiple gates, inner courtyards, and elevation also made escape nearly impossible. During the Hussite Wars in the early 15th century, loyalist forces used it as a base, but as the rebellion spread, the same isolation that had once been a virtue now risked cutting off those inside. Although it never fell, records show that commanders debated abandoning it due to fears of starvation and entrapment. The fate of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, reflects a different version of this trap. Known for constructing elaborate fortifications in the Low Countries, Charles died at the Battle of Nancy in 1477 after a failed siege. In the months leading up to his death, his reliance on walled cities and heavily garrisoned castles gave him a false sense of security. When Swiss and Lorraine forces outmaneuvered him, his own defenses hemmed him in. Unable to retreat, he was surrounded and killed. The structures he trusted were too rigid for the fluid nature of the conflict. In some cases, it wasn't war, but internal politics that sealed the Lord's doom. The Château des Vincennes, outside Paris, served both as royal residence and prison. In 1358, during the Parisian uprising known as the Jacquerie, King John II's son, the future Charles V, fused the fortresses, traps, and isolation not just against enemies, but against suspected members of his own court. Those who once dined in the royal hall found themselves locked behind the same iron gates that had defended them. Castles, by design, assumed the enemy came from outside. But in feudal politics, betrayal often came from within. When trust failed and loyalty fractured, the same gates that had barred the outside world could close permanently. For many medieval lords, the final trap wasn't a murder hole, a hidden pit, or a spiked portcullis. It was the illusion of control inside walls that no longer answered to them,